basically there was two things in my painting career that were game changers for me. One was when I switched to the Raphael 8404 Klinsky Sable brushes. This allowed me to get much more detailed work, more precise work than I'd ever done before with any other brush. The other was my Stay Wet palette. Now, on any given day, I've been known to forget my brushes, forget my paints, forget my wet palette when I go to work. I can get around the brushes, I can get around the paint, but if I forget my wet palette, I'm done for the day. I just go home. The wet palette is an amazing, amazing tool. So let's take a look at it. I use the Masterson Stay Wet palette. For years, I used a Bob the Builder plate from that my son had. I just put a paper towel, folded up. I folded up maybe 4 paper towels so that it was kind of thick, and filled that with water, and then put my baking paper on top. This worked okay, but it was kind of a pain, and it wasn't very, I don't know, professional. I don't know what you want to call it. So one day I picked up a Stay Wet palette from Masterson's. These are amazing. So let's take a look at it. You can get this at any Hobby Lobby, Dick Blick, Michael's, Hobby Store. They come in different sizes. I use this size because it's easy for me to use. It doesn't take up too much space on my table. And basically, it has a lid. I actually use this lid as a second wet palette. I do not use it as a lid per se, and I will get to that in a minute. You'll find that inside of the palette comes with some really cool little palette paper. Now, the first time I ever bought a Masterson Stay Wet palette, I bought probably 4 or 5 extra packs of this palette paper. The problem with this palette paper is, one, it takes about 15 minutes to prep it. You have to put it in the microwave, get it hot, make it transparent. There's all these things. And 2, it lets water through. Now that's a big problem for me because I like to control how much water is in my paints. If my palette paper is letting water through without my permission, I'm completely out of control. So this palette paper is fine if you're using craft paints from the hobby store, the real thick paints, because there's not going to be enough water to mess with the paint that much. Now the paints we use for our hobby paints are much thinner. They're more finely ground. Just a little bit of water is almost too much for them. So what I do with this is I just take it and file it away. We're filing the paper away. And I get started with the painting. Now, it comes with a sponge. This is a yellow sponge. If you can find a white sponge, it would be even better because the yellow sponge kind of tends to tint your paints a little bit. I just learned to get around this. I figured I've learned to view my colors through an orange or a yellow filter. It's not too big of a deal. The other thing cool about this sponge that works better than, like, say, your standard kitchen sponge, it's a very high density sponge. It holds more water in it, and for some reason that works better than just your average kitchen sponge. So I prefer to use the palette sponges that come with this. I always get the refills of it. It works fantastic. Now, the other thing I noticed over years of practice is when you're filling it with water, when I first started, I would fill it just to the point where the sponge got wet, and that's where I'd stop. But what I found was my paints would dry out very quickly. So I learned that if you just keep filling it up, fill the water level right up to the edge of the sponge so that it's just barely on top of the sponge. That is perfect. Now this will keep your paints hydrated for a lot longer. Now, my replacement paper for my wet palette is Reynolds parchment paper. You can get it at any grocery store. I just take it, I cut it into a whole bunch of small sheets, little maybe 4x4, 5x5 sheets, and you'll notice it's always kind of rolly like this, right? Well, that's a problem. Once you put it on the wet palette, it's going to roll up. And what I used to do is flip it over and start painting. But I found that it took me about 45 minutes to really get into, like, for my paints to really start working for me. And the reason for that was when I flipped the palette paper over, it was wet on this side. And I didn't notice that, and so when I put my paints on there, it was getting hydrated with water without my permission. So here's the simple trick that I learned to doing the wet palette. Put your palette paper on, and now it can't roll up. Now you'll see that the parchment paper will roll up like this, and then eventually, after a couple seconds, it relaxes. You see that? And it goes right back down. Perfect. We are ready to paint. Now the other cool thing is there's no water on top of this palette at all. The only water that will go on top of this palette is water that I give permission to go on top of that palette. So just be careful when you're filling up your water level that you don't go too high, because sometimes I will go overboard and my palette paper will start floating around the palette, which is a total pain in the butt. But anyways, I'm going to show you a little bit how I apply the paint to the palette paper and the reasons behind, or what my thinking is behind applying the paint to the palette. So usually what I do is I try to leave some space between the colors. Try to keep my dark colors on one side of the palette and the light colors on the other, so that they don't intermix. Always give your paints a good shake before you put them on. Now you're probably asking yourself, why the heck would you use a wet palette? What does it actually do to the paints? Now some people, their goal for a wet palette is getting it to keep paint wet for a very long time, like a week, a month, a year, who knows. In San Diego, we have a problem with humidity, and things mold very quickly. When I first started, I had a palette mold on me within a couple of days, and that was absolutely disgusting. Because the palette paper is smaller, I can now use my brush to pull water from the palette instead of from my cup. The cool thing about this is when you put your brush into a cup of water, you don't know how much water got sucked up in there. But from the palette, I can see that I just put the tip, and now I can hydrate a little bit of my paint that way. So you can only imagine that once this is molded, that's pretty disgusting. Now some people have ideas that you can put some copper pennies under your sponge. That helps with keeping the mold at bay. You can wash your sponge in bleach, or put a little bleach in the water. My problem is a lot of times I will lick my brush to get the point real fine like that. Like say it's all messed up from painting. A quick lick, and it's constantly in the shape that I want it. I train my brush to stay in that shape. I'm constantly licking it to keep it in that shape. If I've got a moldy sponge, that's pretty disgusting. Now, many of you have probably seen my sponge photos online, and well, here, they kind of look like this. That's not mold. That's all paint. That's just paint from me wiping out my paintbrush. So you can also see that the inside has very little paint in it. The only paint in there is paint that actually went under or whatever. It's not paint that's going through the palette paper. And that's very important to me, because that means that if there's no paint going down through the paper into the sponge, there's no water coming back up into my paint. And I do not want extra water into my paint. In fact, you'll find through these tutorials that I prefer using very little water. So I mean, there are points where I use water liberally, but a lot of times I prefer the paint as thick as possible. In fact, sometimes on my palette I will let paints, especially my highlight colors, I know I'm not going to use them at the start of the day. I may not use this white till 2 hours after I start painting, but I'll put it on the palette anyways because I want it to actually start drying out on the palette. My other thing with the wet palette is I don't use it to save paint over time, over days and days. I only use it to paint for the time that I'm painting. So for me, that could be an 8-hour paint session. Typically, my paints will last that long. Now, if it's a really dry day, say you live in Nevada or somewhere where it's very, very dry, Colorado is another one, you may find that your paints actually dry out very quickly, even on the wet palette. But they will dry out slower than they would normally, and that's the important thing. So, we've got our paints on the palette. The key here is I am not going to add water to the entire blob of paint, right? So let's say this is my mid-tone color that we're going to be working with, right? I will pull from my thick paints and I'll put it over here. Now you'll get good at judging how much paint you need for a project. You may need all of that paint, so maybe we'll start with that. But for now, I'm going to start right here. Now I'm going to leave this paint fairly thick, right? Straight out of the bottle. I'm going to grab a little of this black, put it over here. Now I don't put it right on here, I put it away a little bit, and then that way I can pull it out. Now that's the same way I do my wet blend, my meet in the middle wet blend. I have the two colors separated from each other, and then when they hit, after dragging them over, that's where they blend. So what I'll start doing when I'm setting up my palette is, so that's my shadow, that's my mid-tone, and let's grab a little bit of highlight color, this white, and let's put it right here. Let's move that into my mid-tone color. Now I can pull it back out, because I don't want it to actually be white, I want it to be gray, because I want to save white, extreme white highlights, or just really light gray highlights for the last, but I want it to not be white. So basically I made dark, middle, light, right? Now, the paints start drying out, say, on your palette, and you want to, or they're just not flowing quite the way you want. So you want to add a little bit of water. So you do. You add a little bit of water. But as you can see, look at that. Ah, it's too much water. What do I do now? Well, you've got this thick paint right here that you can pull from, and now your paint's the right consistency again. If you had thinned all that paint right there, you would never have been able to do that, and you would be grabbing more paint. Now the problem I have is, once I start reopening pots of paint, a lot of times that will be enough to get me to quit painting, and that's part of painting, is the mental battle. You want to continue painting as long as possible. So the wet palette is really nice because it keeps your paints liquid for quite a while, and you can mix quite a few different colors right on your palette just like that. Now let's say you want to have like more of this ice yellow type of color for a highlight for whatever reason, but you're doing highlights down in a shadow area. So let's say we grab a little bit of that ice yellow and we bring that into this rich color that we made over here. You see that? So now I've got highlights for my shadow colors as well as highlights for my mid-tone colors, but they're completely different styles of highlights. So the wet palette facilitates all this. If you were doing this on like a tile or even one of those the little cup holders, it's impossible to do this because your paint's going to dry out. So in the time that it took me to mix those colors up, that paint would have dried, or vice versa. So the cool thing with the wet palette is it just lets your paints go for longer and longer. Now, you're painting armies, and let's just say there's times where I paint black all day long, or I paint magenta all day long. So I'll put a bunch of black on my wet palette, and I will start painting. Now that paint, I use pretty much all of it, whereas in the past, when I just had a tile, I would put my blob of paint down, and literally within 10 minutes, that whole blob of paint was dry. Or say you get a phone call or something, it's just ridiculous. So having this on a wet palette is going to keep it dry as long as possible. Now, sometimes after a certain amount of time, your paint will start getting a little bit pasty. It will start drying out, and in future videos you will see me using the dried out paint to really good effect. But sometimes you need the fresh paint. So there are reasons why I will put more fresh paint on the palette even if that paint is still hydrated. And a lot of times that has to do with how it flows. If it's not flowing real well on the model and I'm doing a lot of base coating, I will put some new paint on there just to get the paint to flow a little bit better. Now, the other cool thing with the wet palette is let's say you've got your initial blends down and you want to do a little glaze over it to kind of darken the area. So what I do is I just start grabbing water from out here. As you can see, I can thin this. I can thin it out to literally nothing if I want. So I've got that, but let's say I want another one that's thinned but not thinned as much. So this pocket right here is thinned a little bit less than this, well, about half as less as this pocket. Now, the cool thing with that is now I have 3 shades of this particular color. I have it at its full intensity, as pigmented as it can get. I've got it at half intensity, and I've got it at 1/3 intensity, or maybe even less. There are times when I just want to glaze literally barely any color. Like maybe on a face where you can't have it change the tone of the face that much, but you want just a little bit of that color in there. So you can have multiple shades of color on your palette at once. This is fantastic because this allows you to really open up your painting and explore different styles and techniques, and get new skills with your paintbrush. If you were using just a plain tile, it's not going to do that as much. If you're using the wet palette paper that comes with the Masterson's wet palette, this is almost impossible because as soon as I mix this to 1/3 consistency, it is still adding water there, and by the time I start painting it could be not even half of what I thought it was going to be. So I really encourage you to pay attention to your paints, pay attention to how much water you put in them, and the effect that it gives you. Really, I know it's boring, but really just watch your paint dry, because it's very important to be able to anticipate what's going to happen with your paint. For years, I would do paint sessions at night, and the next morning I'd wake up and I'd be like, "Whoa, what the heck happened? You know, I thought it was so good," but I never stopped to watch the paint dry. And so weird things would happen, you know, as the paint dried. And now I don't have any of those surprises in the morning. When I finish a paint session, the model looks the same. When I'm done putting paint on a model, I know that that's where I put the pigment on that model is where it's going to stay. So it's super boring, and I hate to tell you that, but you really do need to just pay attention and really start seeing the differences in the hydration of your paint. How much water in it? What does it do? How do you have to apply that then to get it to work? Super thinned out paint, you have to paint on very, very thinly. You can't have a big blob of paint on it. You can't put it on like a wash, because you'll get all the little oil marks, you know, the ring around the outside edge of the paint. You don't want that. So, alright, so that's the wet palette. Thank you for watching. I hope you got something out of this. I know it wasn't the most exciting video, but I think it's important to start out on the right foot, and then we can build on that and really bring your painting skills up to the next level. So thank you for watching, and we'll see you soon.